But we're back with a vengeance this week for the Academy live stream. With me, as always, Peter Chalmers. Peter, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Another bright sunny day over here in Sydney, mate.
We
We do a
came
weather check
close.
every single time.
Yeah. It nearly snowed here last night, so
Really?
something quite different over here. Um, with us today, we're very excited to have Giles Bill. Giles, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Long time listener, first time attender.
Cool. And do you want to give us a little bit of the 30, 60-second background, Giles, of what you've been up to?
Okay. So I work as a senior program architect for Salesforce. I've been there for about 15 months now. So I guess my role with Salesforce, at least, is to work out the strategy on how to effectively operate Salesforce for some of our larger customers. And prior to that, I was very much in the AWS space, in the cloud space generally. I've been in the ecosystem in Sydney for many years now, probably about 20. And I guess my background prior to that was the developer track, Java, Lotus Notes, AS400. So yeah, I've been around for quite a long time. So I'm really enjoying my time with Salesforce at the moment. It's a growing company and there's some exciting things going on.
Excellent. So because, as you've just mentioned, you are with the mothership of Salesforce, we're just going to bring the forward-looking statement up on screen. I'm sure everyone who's ever been to any kind of Salesforce-related event has seen this slide before. It is there, and just if we were to talk about anything in the future, please do not make buying decisions based upon that. So with that done, let's dive into today's conversation. So we want to talk about DevOps in the context of Salesforce, which is, I guess, DevOps as a term has kind of become a hot topic in recent years. And it could be fair to say Salesforce has been playing a little bit of catch up in terms of the sophistication of some of the tooling in this space, but has come on in leaps and bounds in the last 2 to 3 years from my opinion. But why don't we sort of just kick off, Giles, and just from your point of view, what is DevOps for Salesforce?
Yeah, I think you're right that Salesforce have been playing catch up for some time now, and their tooling, as of at least from a technical point of view, is so much more advanced than it has been than it was, say, a couple of years ago even. But I guess DevOps for Salesforce is the same as DevOps everywhere. The idea, at least in my mind, and there's so many definitions of what DevOps is, but I think it's the coming together of people, processes, and tools in an effective way to deliver quality software. From a Salesforce point of view, the idea of being able to automate and guarantee quality in the software that we're delivering and the way we can package software on the platform has changed dramatically, and I think it's opened it up to a larger developer community. But DevOps, in a nutshell, is the coming together of the culture, an agile approach to how we work, the processes around how we guarantee or at least try and mitigate risk through quality, and then the automation on how we actually achieve that through the tooling that underlies the DevOps on Salesforce. So that's, I guess, what my thinking is around DevOps.
If we think about what things were like when we first started in the Salesforce space, so 10 years ago, actually.
Yeah.
The advancement I think we've seen in that tools, and the fact we've actually got tools there, that Salesforce have got those tools, but there are other tools out there that you can use as well, or is it just you can only use the Salesforce branded ones?
No, I think what they've done over the past few years with the CLI has really opened it up to anyone really with it who can use a CLI. There's webhooks into everything. It's all web-based. It's all web service-based. So there's no reason that you have to stay on platform. The CLI has really opened it up. But there are ways that you can. There are enough vendors out there who are offering DevOps type capabilities on platform, and there's other schools of thought that go off platform. And I really think that's down to the ability and the experience of the teams that are on that DevOps journey. Certainly the on-platform tools take away a lot of the pain of setting all of this up. And it is a journey. It's not something that you can do straight away. You have to kind of get into it slowly and build up the capability. At least that's what we've seen.
Right. And for those that are not developers, CLI means?
Oh, command line interface. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah. Just saying. Don't know.
Yeah.
I did guess it, by the way, but yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Pete.
So just having a look at our next question. So the other thing, one thing I sort of try to understand also is, Salesforce has got change sets. We've also now got Salesforce DX. Is there a place, what's the right tool set that you're using, or what's the right blend of things? When would you use a change set versus pushing something via DX, for example?
Again, I think that's ideally in the perfect world. You would look to be pushing everything through some kind of flow, right? From test or from development all the way up through and into production. Then you can apply the same quality checks regardless of whether it's a code change or a configuration change. But the reality is that a lot of companies will just push changes through change sets. I think, again, it comes down to the amount, the size of your team and how much you want to scale that team. I mean, there's nothing wrong with change sets, but as we all know, trying to deploy something large through change sets, it becomes a bit of a nightmare. But if I guess it's down to the organization. It's down to your capability. If you're happy with deploying through change sets, then maybe you have some guidelines around what's change settable versus what should be probably pushed, have some more rigor around that release and be pushed through more of a formal testing kind of pipeline. And so I guess there's no one size fits all for that.
But should you set some kind of methodology of what you're going to follow up in the beginning, or do you really take an agile approach to these things? Because the other thing is tool sets keep changing too. So.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you need to. I think before you get into anything around what tools you're going to use, it's absolutely critical to get your processes in place and get your culture right. So whether you're going or you take, I think with Salesforce, and I've written a couple of blogs about this, you never really get a project, implement it, and you're done. You're always improving that. It's a cycle of continuous improvement, which I think is the same with most software these days. And the agile approach really lets you do that. It lets you pivot and keep on releasing small incremental releases. And the idea is that you get the feedback on those releases and you pivot based on what's good and what's bad. And I think that the tooling now really enables teams to adopt a more agile approach to how they release and how they can scale the size of those teams without any risks to the quality of the software that they're delivering. Or I should say mitigating those risks, because there's always going to be risks. But if you can set up your processes such that you can mitigate those risks through quality checks, through testing, peer review, that kind of thing, then that's much better than just slamming a change set into production and hoping for the best.
Who would do that?
Who would do that?
No one would do that.
Yeah.
Why not just do the change in production? I'm waiting for the screams. No.
So Giles, how if someone's at the beginning of that journey, what would be some of the criteria that they might look at to decide, what's the right tool and approach for them as they kind of embark on it?
So I think it's a little bit of a investigation into what works for you. Again, I think it comes down to the maturity and the experience of your team. So maybe have experience outside of Salesforce in your CI/CD tools, things like Jenkins, Bamboo, Circle CI, those kind of tools. Build services, basically orchestrate a lot of the automation around releasing software and testing it. If you have those skills, you'd probably head down that track and just see what's available, and then get involved with the CLI. So you download the CLI. We've got the plugins now for VS Code, which is kind of our de facto IDE that we use. They're amazing. It's just come on in leaps and bounds in terms of what you can do in the IDE around developing proper Apex code. And I think you have to just take a step back and do some due diligence. That's it. I mean, you have to just assess what tool's going to work for you. Do you go on platform? Do you go off platform? And start small. But absolutely, the first thing, and I recommend the first thing that anyone does, is get their metadata off the platform and into some kind of source control. So I think that's just key, irrespective of whether you use change sets for deployment or not. It's almost just a backup of your data, of your metadata, I should say.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna ask. Like, essentially, you're making that decision of where your source of truth is going to be. And ultimately, in the change set world, production becomes your source of truth for everything. But moving to a version control system, GitHub or otherwise, Bitbucket, to say, okay, now this is my source of truth, and I can deploy that to any org. It could be a sandbox, could be production, whatever, and have the processes built around that to ensure Absolutely. The smooth deployment from. And come up with your branching strategy and the rest of it. Yeah,
but that takes time, and it's certainly something that's maybe unfamiliar to certainly a lot of Salesforce developers, because I mean, if you've just come in up the Salesforce track and you haven't had development outside of the Salesforce environment, then some of these things are quite new, and how version control and branching and what's the best strategy around that. So I think it takes time to bed in, and there's a learning curve in how you implement what branching strategy, for instance, you might go with, and you work towards it, and you slowly evolve that over time, as opposed to just diving in and ruining everyone's day.
Not that we've ever seen that happen again.
No,
and I think the tooling's. Sorry, you go.
Sorry, I was saying this is something very much that we see in our PA role with customers who want to move to transition to this kind of way of working with Salesforce now, as they see the value of being able to deploy time, increase or reduce your time to market and deploy more quality software and scale their capability and potentially into offshoring, and it's not just Salesforce, and then you have your other dependencies that you can start to include in that pipeline as well.
I was just going to say, I think your earlier point was spot on in terms of the CLI has kind of been the game changer to that. You could use Ant scripts and other things that hitting the metadata API in the years earlier, but it was a little bit haphazard, and not all the configuration in the org was available and the like. So you kind of always had okay, we can do an automated deploy, but here's the caveats of things, manual post-deploy steps or different things. Whereas now what I'm seeing, and certainly our large complex customers, is the ability to do one button push large complex deploy with very, very few post-deploy kind of manual steps, which is kind of like slowly getting to the holy grail.
It really has come a long way, hasn't it?
It's quite exciting. And I think the new VS Code, I can't remember what it's called, but basically the web-based version of VS Code, which may or may not one day replace the developer console, or probably augment the developer console. I think that's amazing. So you can basically do everything in the browser. Now, whether that's going to be fit for purpose for really complex coding, I'm not sure, but it's certainly for the smaller things. Having that integrated SOQL Explorer and Query Explorer and Apex debugging and whatnot, all in the browser would be fantastic.
We had Trailhead DX the other week. I must admit, I didn't watch it because I decided to sleep instead. Did you guys see anything come out of that around any of this stuff? Was there anything interesting, anything exciting?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of stuff coming out, but the most exciting ones for me, at least, were the Artist Code Builder. So it's web-based IDE, which is based, I think, on code blocks. So it's Microsoft code blocks. And the other one, probably the one I'm most excited about, is the functions, or Evergreen it was previously called. It's now called Salesforce Functions.
Okay.
Which really is going to enable you to expand Salesforce in new ways using, currently I think the support's going to be for Node and Java, as well as Apex. So being able to build out more services in different languages is going to be pretty amazing.
Yeah,
I think that'll be huge, just for, as you say, opening up the developer community and bringing people into the Salesforce world who'd previously said, look, I don't want to learn Apex. Here's my way of doing things. But just bringing those open languages into the platform will be huge.
Absolutely. And the stuff that Apex is just not very good at, you can look at passing that off to a Java or to a Node to do. The one they always gets cited is anything to do with binary file manipulation, PDFs, that kind of thing. So you got the libraries in, say, Java that then you can use to do some really powerful stuff that you just cannot do in Apex. So I think that's going to be pretty huge.
So was that move away from to that to expand the ultimately the developer pool, or is it just it's a more contemporary way of doing things now? Or
I think it's just I don't think it's to it's certainly not to replace what Apex does. I think it's just to augment what you can do on a platform, because you've got in this function, this Salesforce function, you basically got the context of your login. You're working within context of Salesforce, so you don't have all the framework code to deal with. So it just knows, and then you can start to use some of the libraries that are maybe not available for Apex, but you can get in other languages. And I think that the support for or for other languages will probably grow over time as well.
So I think that probably an example previously is you might have had to build something like that, go and host it on Heroku, and then you've got your Apex code calling out to a web service to perform some operation, and for your example, save a PDF back into an attachment, and now you can kind of do that as a more seamless operation, I presume, as once all this comes together.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to I guess and I don't know what's going to happen here, is how you deal with dependency management in those functions, in those environments as well. So how that ties in to the whole developer the DX experience, I'm not sure yet, but I'm interested to see.
That could be a good segue to what does CI/CD look like in the Salesforce space when you start to try and tie all this together?
So again, fundamentally not no different to CI/CD in any other space. So CI/CD is continuous integration and continuous delivery. We tend to see that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations adopt the CI part. And in terms of the delivery, at least into production, is still quite very much a controlled process. I mean, I guess the fundamentals behind CI/CD is to iterate fast and release quickly. And I think the CI part, so the continuous integration of me being able to develop software, check that in, have that peer reviewed, have that tested, is really important. And there's loads of tools that will support that flow. The continuous delivery side of things, I still see it gaining a bit of traction, but not massive at the moment. I think with Salesforce that there needs to be a level of governance in releasing out to production, particularly with larger releases. But then again, the idea is that you kind of iterate on smaller pieces of work and release more frequently. That's the idea.
So we've talked a lot about the development tools. We've talked about basically a lot of that developer space. If I'm an admin, how can I and should I get into that Salesforce DevOps space? What's a path for me to understand and start playing with that type of stuff?
Well, I mean, there's heaps of trails out there on DevOps and application lifecycle management. There's so much stuff out there. So go and do the badges would be the first thing. But I think that there's absolutely a role for administrators to play. And I think if administrators are making changes changes that potentially could break something in an org, then their changes should be subject to exactly the same pipeline and testing as your more, I guess, code-based changes that are coming through. So I think, yes, the admin needs to understand, and it really depends on how you actually implement your CI, your continuous integration, and whether you go down the scratch org route versus a sort of more traditional sandbox route. But however you do it, I think you still have to have an understanding of what CI is, and potentially if you're going down scratch orgs, what your scratch org, the processes around allocating that and templating your orgs and that kind of thing as well. So and ultimately, as an administrator, you will be administrating it.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that a Salesforce administrator needs to have knowledge of that process and how it all fits together. I don't see that being any different from a developer.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the reasonably steep learning curve for admins in particular, probably more around the Git process than just the sheer notion of I've done some work, I need to pull it down with this command and deploy it with this command. But it's when you get into merge conflicts and the different nuances of version control, that's where I've seen admins or non-developers in general really lean on developers to help work through that. And I think that's just teamwork in action. You wouldn't necessarily expect an admin to become a Git expert, as long as the process is defined and there's support on hand when they get stuck.
Absolutely. And I think, and again, the tool, your selection of tools, so you go down an on-platform kind of CI solution on platform, saying on Salesforce, it does a lot of work to try and abstract away anything, you get pulls and pushes and merge conflicts and all of that kind of thing is to a large extent abstracted away. So it makes it easier from an admin point of view, but arguably from a developer point of view, you lose a bit of flexibility. It's a balancing act.
Yep. Sounds about normal for Salesforce. Always a balancing act.
Giles, you mentioned scratch orgs in there briefly. What's your sort of opinion on on them, and have you seen anyone with that slick setup where a branch can be deployed to a scratch org and tested specifically there? That kind of quite, I guess, more complex way of setting things up.
We do have customers who are doing that, but I haven't personally seen it yet. I mean, if you're going down that greenfields route, you would really need to Salesforce, and you had the chance to set it up properly. Then I think scratch orgs, and you're going to be doing some pretty intensive development on the platform. Then scratch orgs are the way to go, because you can scale that out really easily. But I think the problem with, at least from my experience, the problem I see with existing orgs is the ability to decompose what's in Salesforce in the metadata down to something that you can actually deploy to a scratch org easily and work in relative isolation without, because managing those dependencies between those packages, the scratch org packages, becomes a bit of a nightmare. That's what I've seen. And I think this is in beta now. So the idea that we're going to be able to, the other thing about scratch orgs is that they can track changes. So any change that you make to a scratch org is basically tracked by the tooling API. So you can actually see what has changed in an org versus what has changed in your source control repository, which is a really powerful thing. They're now going to enable that, or I think it's in beta now, is to enable that same capability in developer orgs as well. So then you get a choice on how you potentially want to decompose what you're working on. Hopefully that makes sense. And then the other thing, which I believe is in beta at the moment, is the ability to deploy packages to developer orgs that have dependencies already on the org. So it does the validation when it actually deploys it, as opposed to pre-deploying it, which will be amazing and make life a lot easier. So it means that you don't necessarily have to break down your org metadata into easily sort of individual components that you can work on independently. It gives you a bit more sort of coarse-grained ability to manage your dependencies, which is and that is the holy grail, if you ask me, is being able to easily deploy small components as opposed to these big, huge, massive deployments, but also know that you don't have to manage the dependencies, the kind of incumbent dependencies to those components, because they get deployed, because they already exist in the org that you're deploying to. I just went on a ramble then.
No, it's all good.
Yeah,
it's sort of slightly over my head.
Giles, how about testing and automated testing? How does that fit into a process like this?
Again, so part of your CI, your continuous integration process. So usually the process is some derivative of checking out your code, or bringing your code down for source control, bringing your source from an org, from your developer org or your scratch org, and making sure they're in sync, making your changes, committing that back. That would generally go to some kind of peer review. So your commit would kick off a peer review before it gets committed to, say, another branch. And then it's at this point where we can start to implement or bring on some automated testing. So when I say I want to auto deploy a feature that I've been working on into an org, then I can set up my CI pipeline to then conduct a bunch of automated tests on that org. And there's plenty of vendors out there who offer automated test platforms that will help you, write and curate these tests over time. And so you have an automated test as part of a CI build, but potentially automated test as part of regression testing once it gets into production as well. So it's very much a quality check and should be part of any CI pipeline if you want to mitigate that risk of delivering something that is going to break.
Yeah, and just Giles, these tests that you talk about, there's obviously the kind of Apex unit tests that Salesforce will run, particularly with a production deploy. But you're also talking about these different testing frameworks that, for want of a better description, they can mimic clicking on different front end items. They've spun up an environment, logged in, and can actually check that the functionality from a user experience point of view, follows a particular path and it hasn't been broken.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of maybe have one or two paths through your application that you want to test, a happy path and an unhappy path. I mean, you can't test everything. And so that test then becomes part of that CI flow as well. And other tests potentially could include integration testing as well. So you might want to do live integration testing once you hit a specific environment where you have a non-prod integration, something that you want to integrate. So you start to bake in more and more testing as your feature proceeds through the pipeline before it gets to production.
Yeah. And at that point, you're really bringing in multiple skill sets into your team. Kind of as you're saying earlier, it's all about what's the capability of the team and the sophistication that you kind of want to build up. And I guess that depends customer by customer as to what's their use case for the platform and how important is it that nothing gets to production that could possibly break something because you've got 10,000 users and the help desk is going to be inundated if we break some core functionality type thing.
Absolutely. And the other big one as well is for the for the preview, the release previews, is just at least being able to deploy to a preview sandbox and run those tests over that. This is always a big one, depending on the level of customization you've made in an org.
Okay. I don't think we've got any more questions at this point.
Yeah,
Dan, do you have
I thought we could change tack slightly, and given Giles' experience, and sort of given our audience is more at the admin end, sort of running Giles, and I guess you go into clients and help them do reviews, and I was curious, is there any mistakes you've seen or best practices that you think are really important to follow so that you don't get yourself in a situation 3 years into your implementation that's like, oh, if we'd only done this differently from the start, we wouldn't be undoing a whole bunch of stuff now?
Yeah, I think it's really important to establish up front what your guidelines are going to be around, or your principles around, say, clicks versus code, where you're going to try and leverage the inbuilt tools on the platform versus coding that. And in some cases, despite the best attempts to use the tools on the platform, you often have to code. So if you do, what are your quality guidelines around coding? So code, you want to be able to guarantee, or you want your regression testing, absolutely, but there's also quite a lot of tools that will then go out and code scan for quality on that code. Ideally, your unit tests, I think we've all seen this, people write unit tests just to ensure that they've covered the code, so you've covered that quota of code that you need to do to release it to production. But I think the role of unit tests, you can expand that to start, at least from a regression test perspective, to start testing some of the or some of the configuration-based code as well. So if you've got flows in there, you've got workflows, whatever it is that you have, you can kind of test the outcomes of that through unit testing as well. And I think that's quite powerful. But yeah, so look, more often than not, you're going in somewhere that's already well established. So I'll tell you, one of the customers I'm working for at the moment has 6 different Salesforce orgs in the organization, and a biggest challenge for me there is trying to get some consistency across those different orgs, so we can do things like integration and backup and data recovery and that kind of thing a bit more easily even because these orgs have all been developed by different partners, so everyone's done something slightly differently, but at the end of the day the use cases are quite similar across what the customer's trying to do. So the challenge there has been to try and drive some architectural and operational consistency across that, and we're slowly getting there. But yeah, I mean, ideally you go in, we have best practices, we have standards, and that, you know, they've been developed from experience in the field, and there's heaps of information out there on the best way to go around making those choices on whether you go code, low code, or no code. And so try and establish those guidelines and try and establish a design authority or some kind of role that takes that technical oversight role with Salesforce. I think that's really important as well. Again, I think I went on a tangent there.
No, that's the way we do things. Yeah, I think you're right in that the maturity of the platform as a whole has come a long way, and so the maturity of the organizations that use it has had to come along. I recall, like 12 years ago, a lot of times it was actually the business that was signing up for Salesforce on their credit card and kind of deploying into their sales team for basic SFA and the likes, and then slowly over time the kind of IT's come along and actually started to realize that some rigor needs to be put around things, and that's where I guess the tooling has come along around the same way. It's actually people have built some pretty mission critical applications on the platform now, and need to be treated with the kind of respect that deserves. Otherwise, you could have big financial implications for a customer if your order process is broken, your billing process is broken. These kind of core. It's no longer the soft functionality of contact tracking and things that it started out, and so I think the rigor which all of this DevOps stuff plays into has really started to play out, and at the end of the day, it's a living, breathing system. To one of your points earlier, it's not a case of, well, we do this project and we finish the project and then we walk away and we don't touch the system for 12 months until the next project comes along. Once you've got those 3 releases a year, that in itself now is just understanding the impact to your org from what's the next release. What are the critical updates I need to review, get my head around, test in a sandbox first, and roll on through to production, so that you're not going to experience some downtime. So ultimately it's a good thing that we're seeing a lot more rigor in the platform.
Absolutely, but it's a learning curve very much, but a good learning curve, and I think it sets you get your head around the concepts that we've discussed or we've been discussing today. I think they're just as applicable in any environment, not just Salesforce. So I think finally seeing Salesforce embrace the developer community, because I think ultimately it's a really powerful platform, and a lot of organizations that I've talked to don't, they just see Salesforce and they think CRM, opportunities and contacts, and you don't see the underlying, I guess, capabilities as a real legitimate platform as a service as well, that you can develop, as you say, mobile responsive apps in a matter of hours on it, and that's huge. It's absolutely huge, but you have to be able to guarantee, or at least as much as possible guarantee, what that quality is. So that's where your DevOps, your CI/CD, all these processes come together to play a role.
I think it's all part of that maturity of not just the platform, but the customers as well. All those tool sets, you mentioned backup and recovery before. I mean, that was something that years ago no one ever considered, because, Salesforce has all my data, and if we need to, we can We can always get it back if there's an issue there. But that's not the case anymore. So we've seen the evolution of those things develop as the maturity of the customers and how wide those customers are as well have changed over time. So
yeah, for sure.
Peter, that's whether intended or not, a brilliant segue into a live question we've just had from the audience.
Oh, well, it was not intended.
Data backup options. What would you recommend, especially with the data recovery service being retired by Salesforce?
I mean, they're all much of a muchness, I think, in their capabilities. I personally had experience with a vendor called Grax, who do data backup through Heroku onto, the database or the object store of your choice. It's usually AWS on S3. They've been really good. They've got a whole bunch of. It's a very good product. Basically, it lets you do your backup, your archiving, your restore, point-in-time restores based on the level, what you need to restore. But there's the other one probably that I've worked with and this was for a government department as well, was ODeceiver, where they had on top of data backup and recovery, they also had records keeping requirements. So how long do you have to keep records and how do you dispose of those records over time? And it was quite easy to extend that to deal with the records management side of things, as well as archiving, as well as backup and restore. But from a general point of view, they're all quite similar in functionality and what they do, and I don't really want to choose one over the other. I remain impartial.
Very good.
We've implemented own backup for a customer before, so I've got my hands dirty on that. And when I say it was just really easy to set up and easy to use, and it did exactly what it was meant to do. It backs up.
Which one was that?
Or own backup. So.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But not as so. It's good, but then I think Grax is sort of that next level up again from own backup. So it depends. Comes down to the use case, like all these things.
Yeah. And the other thing, I guess, the thing that we see a lot is you've got your backup and restore, and people always, I guess there's a bit of confusion in generally that Salesforce will offer that, they'll offer the durability of the platform itself, and they'll always make sure they can restore your data. But if you lose your data from whenever they retire the backup service, it means you've lost that data. So yeah, it's the end of July, isn't it? So if that's important to you, then you need to have something in place to easily, and it's easy enough to save it, to back it up off platform, but restoring it is a whole new challenge, which is where these tools come into play.
And that's the thing that people forget to test. Yes, I bought a backup service, but when I have to go and recover, how do I recover that? And what happens with the record IDs and things like that?
And they also offer quite a few. You can back up between, or you can back up and restore to sandboxes, and you can do data masking and all kinds of other things as well. There's quite a lot of features on these tools. And the other big one, which I see quite often, is those backups. You can also, if you want to in time, move those into a data warehouse and start to do some analytics on that as well. So that's always
data lake. You mean that's
data lake, data warehouse
anymore?
Into your context-bound data mart.
That was 4 words that I
like that one. But you can move it somewhere and look at it, and start to look at it in the context of other information from other systems as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, that's probably a good spot for us to start to wrap up. So, otherwise, Giles, thank you very much for your time today. It is most appreciated, and it's been really fantastic to have a chat.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for coming along.
Cheers.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
See ya.